Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Revi Sterling takes a seat, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you. This afternoon, I'm so pleased to welcome Mackenzie Wark, a professor at the New School. He's written a fascinating new book called A Hacker Manifesto. I've read through it twice, and I'm beginning to dimly understand a few parts of it, so I'm glad that he's here to explicate a lot of it to us this afternoon. It's a fascinating look at information and how we deal with it on economic terms. And I know this is something that we all think a lot about within this company, and we touch many parts of this work, A Hacker Manifesto, both personally and in our jobs in the public sphere. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Wark is here to talk with us today, and I hope you all enjoy his work as much as I have. Please welcome Mackenzie Wark.
Thank you, Tamara. Can you hear me from here, or
that works? Great. Yeah. It's wonderful to be here. I got to tell you, I thought the last place I'd come touring with this book would be Microsoft. But the beauty of doing books, you put them out in the world, and you end up having conversations you didn't anticipate having, and that's the kind of the pleasure of being a writer, I think. I don't have a lot of PowerPoint because I'm just so over it, but there are a few slides I'm gonna throw up. Information wants to be free, but is everywhere in chains, is, I think, the theme of this particular book. And I've married Stuart Brandon Rousseau, the two halves of the quote, and the book tries to deal with both halves of it together. I found this marvelous quote in the last show I did. By changing the character of work, the world changes its way of thinking, might be the sort of methodological basis. I found this in a museum in Pittsburgh where I was speaking last week. It just struck me as really this crazy Serbian artist who writes manifestos, you know, and they're on the walls. That struck me as appropriate, and I've left it in from that talk. A Hacker Manifesto. The beauty of manifestos as a form of writing is that the way I would think about it is it's understanding a complex world by kind of cutting through it in one slice. In Kill Bill, you know, that one slice that gets cleanly through a kind of a moving and complicated situation. So it has to keep in mind both sides of it, that it's a simplifying gesture, but that the world you're writing about is immensely complicated. Because I tried to get the world into about 200 pages, and that's not easy, as some of you may know. I'm going to read just a tiny little bit of the text. There is a double spooking the world, the double of abstraction. The fortunes of states and armies, companies and communities depend on it. All contending classes, the landlords and farmers, the workers and capitalists, revere yet fear the relentless abstraction of the world on which their fortunes yet depend. All classes but one, the hacker class. Whatever code we hack, be it programming language, poetic language, math or music, curves or colorings, we create the possibility of new things entering the world. Not always great things or even good things, but new things. In art, in science, in philosophy, in culture, in any production of knowledge where data can be gathered, where information can be extracted from it, and where in that information new possibilities for the world are produced, there are hackers hacking the new out of the old. But while hackers create these new worlds, we do not possess them. And so we don't quite know who we are. And while we recognize our distinctive existence as a group, as programmers, as artists or writers or scientists or musicians, we rarely see these ways of representing ourselves as mere fragments of a class experience that is still struggling to express itself as expressions of the process of producing abstraction in the world. Geeks and freaks become what they are negatively through the exclusion by others. Hackers are a class, but a virtual class, a class as yet to hack itself into manifest existence as itself. It goes on in that vein for roughly 300 numbered paragraphs, and I won't kind of, go through more of it. And the picture is, I always wanted what's called a face-out in the book trade, and I got it in Shakespeare & Co., one of my favourite New York bookstores, and there it is, like nested with these other books. And it's also a little image of the paradox that, on the one hand, the theme of the book is freeing information from property, and yet it's sort of manifested as an object. It's not a call for purity, it's a call for understanding the contradictions of the situation in which we find ourselves. And on the left, those are the chapter headings, and they're arranged alphabetically. I'm not going to speak to all of them, but feel free to pull up those, and there's a concept behind each one that I'm happy to kind of talk about. But I want to start with the concept of hacking itself. And I wanted to build a sense of a shared set of interests that those of us who produce information might have. And then you go looking for a terminology for that. And the whole thing about trying to construct a new way of seeing the world is you have to kind of make up a language for it as you go along. And the reason I landed on hacking and trying to broaden the sense of what that might mean was firstly to acknowledge the fact that I think programming is the new form of creativity of the 20th century, in that it transforms all other ways of making things. And it doesn't matter if you talk to people in science or the arts, their work is being transformed by the incursion of the digital, and then programming is the mode of creativity that keeps opening that up and creating new dimensions to that. So on the one hand, it's honouring that as what's transformed the creative process, but on the other hand, it's can we understand that as the model for all forms of creativity that yields what we would now call intellectual property at the end of the day, which is what makes us equivalent. So while one might think that to be a programmer is different to be an artist, or different to be a scientist, or to be one type of scientist is to be different to be another kind, what renders what we do equivalent is turning it into property. X amount of this patent is worth Y amount of that copyright in the marketplace. So there is a rendering equivalent regardless of what we might think culturally. So when I say hacker, it's not a cultural term, it's a kind of social or analytic term about that what we do has been rendered equivalent. But if one talks about class, to take the second category, and you might notice one of the defensive measures of the Republican Party is to say the other side is engaging in class war. No, that's class war. It's like, well, wait a minute, aren't you guys doing class war like big time and just kind of like not talking about it? Let me see, billionaires don't want to pay taxes anymore. Isn't that part of a class view of the world? So I wanted to put that term sort of back on the agenda and to sort of think through the category of class a little bit. And if part of my argument is that those of us who produce intellectual property have a class interest in the way in which property exists in the world, then there is a corresponding class on the other side, which is those who accumulate portfolios of intellectual property and then attempt to control the chain of production and distribution through that ownership. And what I think you see in the United States in particular is a kind of hollowing out of the corporate space, where more and more of the actual productive component is now somewhere else. It's contracted out, or there's a subsidiary that just does that somewhere else. And what the kind of corporate culture is much more about is the maintenance of the brand, the maintenance of a portfolio of copyrights and trademarks. And that has been made possible by the construction of this category of intellectual property, which, let's not forget, and property is also on the list, is a relatively new term. People don't talk about intellectual property before the 60s. Yes, there are patents and copyrights and various other forms of the protection of information, but bringing these things together and understanding them as the same thing or as equivalent things is a relatively recent development. And I don't want to read retrospectively copyright or patent as always having been that. It seems to me that the new discourse treats them as private property rights, whereas the classical conception of copyright in particular is something quite different. So, three terms already: to think about class, to think about hacking, to think about property. And can we use these as sort of conceptual tools for organising a kind of world picture of what's happening at this particular moment in our world? And world is the last term. The section writing is the notes, but it's the last kind of real term in the book. But to speak to a minute about history, which will get us to the concept of world, to see a sort of a three-stage evolution of abstraction being let loose in the world. And that three-stage process would look something like this. We tend to talk about capitalism or the market economy as if it was always the same thing, as if it had always been some sort of similar thing. But it seems to me it went through three stages. And the first begins with the privatization of land. There's a process by which land becomes abstracted. It's something that you can hold as an absolute form of property, buy and sell, and then those who farm on it become tenants of those who own it. You get the original kind of class relation based on ownership, non-ownership of land. And this is still the process and the struggle that's going on in vast kind of tracts of the world. Who owns land is still a huge issue in Brazil. It's still a huge issue in China, for example. So it's not as if that transformation of peasant life into that split between the farmer and the landlord is over. It's a major process happening in the world. But it gets glommed onto and made subsidiary to a second process that thinks of property in a slightly more abstract way, where capital becomes something that can also be thought of within the framework of a set of private property rights. And it produces the second stage, capitalist versus worker, a more abstract form of class relation that's based on not something fixed in place, something tangible, fungible, transformable. But what happens in our own time is a third abstracting, a third stage in history, where a new set of private property relations create a new division. And I've called that hacker class on the one hand. The other class I call vectoralist. Call them what you like. I don't care about the terminology, but I thought those controlling the vectors by which information move and the portfolio of forms in which information can be held and moved strikes me as an emergent kind of, dare I say, ruling class formation. Whether it's a separate ruling class or a new faction, make up your own mind. But clearly it's an element in the transformation of the political landscape that we're sort of living through at this very moment. Now, the good news is that each stage in the sort of progressive abstraction of the world opens up whole new domains of new productivity, and production is another one of these central categories that I want to look at, to make nature productive, to free resources. That's what this three-stage process opens up and heads towards. It's, in other words, generally a good thing, and as far as I'm concerned, irreversible. That we bought a one-way ticket to modernity wherever it goes. There's no going back, even though you might notice romanticism is a strong theme in culture at the moment. Everybody's kind of fantasizing about going back to village life, whether that means eating organic food or a return to some kind of strict religious order. But frankly, we bought a one-way ticket to further and further abstraction, and deal with it, you know, would be would be my kind of philosophy on that. We've got to kind of deal with that. We're going to feed this many billion peoples with traditional modes of agriculture. I don't think so. It's just not going to work. So, how do we make the future livable with the new rather than returning to the old? Would be where I'm coming from on this. But something very, very strange seems to me to happen when we reach a certain kind of threshold of abstraction in our relations of production. And that is that we reach a point where information is increasingly coming to have a kind of completely arbitrary relation to the material form in which it's embedded. So, for example, all the information in this book is also on the internet somewhere. You could search for it, you could print it out, you could put it on a floppy disk or a CD, and it would be pretty much the same thing. The digital, almost but not quite, renders any expression of information onto any material form equivalent. And that strikes me as a whole new stage. But we're living in a world in which the way we think about production and the way we think about the law to govern information as property is still thinking in a kind of mechanical way. But we suddenly have created this at least partial escape from scarcity. Information really does want to be free, it seems to me, and we're sort of finally realizing what its actual nature is. Our technology is producing the means by which we understand its nature. And its nature is to escape the laws of scarcity. But yet scarcity is the central category in which our economic thought has evolved. Anybody remember this from Economics 101? It's like desires are infinite, but means are scarce, therefore we need resource allocation. And you really can't beat the market as a way to do that 9 times out of 10. Here are the exceptions. We'll never talk about them ever again. Now let's talk about the market. That's what I remember from learning economics. And it holds good for a big chunk of the world, just not for all of it. But it strikes me one of the exceptional categories ends up being information, that it at least partially escapes the law of scarcity. And economists will tell you that information is a non-rivalrous resource. We all know what an oxymoron is, or an oxymoron, yeah? Is this not one? A non-rivalrous good, rather. Non-rivalrous good. Hang on, if it's non-rivalrous, it just ain't a good anymore. It's flipped over into some category for which we don't yet have the tools of understanding. And yet it seems to me that in everyday conflicts and struggles over information, that those possibilities keep getting thrown at us over and over again anyway. And under the heading of revolt, which is on the list here, one thing I would put is piracy as a social movement. That it's not something that is just to be treated as an exception to a law, but that it forms the basis of a social movement that one has to either suppress or negotiate with, those being the two options really. But it's a kind of bottom-up, intuitive understanding of information as something that is owned collectively. It seems to me is what popular culture is deciding about information. Those bizarre advertisements from the motion picture people notwithstanding. And I'm sure we've seen some of these ads. There have been various campaigns. The one I love is the one that shows some kid downloading on the screen, and then you cut to people dancing to the same tune. And when the downloading finishes, the music stops, and all the kids who are dancing have lost their music because someone pirated it. And the thing is that in terms of the nature of information, we know that's just absolutely false. It's based on a false premise. One person's possession of it doesn't dispossess somebody else. It's a false analogy. It doesn't really work that way. We could shove it into a legal framework where it does work that way, but it's not the nature of information. We're trying to counteract ontology, it seems to me. So, as with all social movements, they mount extreme demands. You might remember from the 60s, be realistic, demand the impossible. Or beneath the pavement lies the beach. It's in the nature of social movements to be utopian, extremist and absolute. But it's in the nature of politics to be about negotiation, compromise, fudges, third ways. It's like the antithesis of the technical, if you like. So what strikes me as interesting is how that struggle will play out. That there's a kind of everyday struggle over whether information is to be privately owned or publicly owned. Is it a common that's produced by everybody, and we want it back, please? Or is it something that can be strapped to a set of legal and technical limits on its possibility? And then what are the consequences for the rest of growth and transformation and productivity if you do that? In forcing it back into that box, are you in fact then limiting the way in which the rest of the economic, social, technical world might evolve and develop? The price, it seems to me, might be very, very high. So, can we think through the kind of classic language of social and political thought and understand what's going on around us as not a set of anomalies, but fitting a pattern, that a new kind of class, dare I say, class struggle has emerged around the category of information, and that it pits two extreme views against each other, and where we haven't yet found the kind of third way between those. It might be what Professor Lessig is offering as a model. I find Creative Commons a kind of interesting experiment. What I wanted to do in this book was kind of outflank it on the left and offer a somewhat more extreme view of what the potential might be for freeing information from the property constraint. I'm not sure at the end of the day if I even agree with all of my own book. but it seemed to me that somebody had to make that case, if only to make Professor Lessig seem like a moderate. Because you might notice it's treated as something of an extreme position, that he wants something less than what our founding fathers in this country anticipated. That's somehow become an extreme thing to want. Well, I thought I would take the demand everything position, which would be, what if we construed our interest as producers of information, as liberating it from the property constraint altogether? What if we entertained that as a possibility, and where would it lead? Struck me as a question that was at least worth posing. So that, you know, as a sort of political realist, you know, I've got my kind of cultural utopian side and then my political realist side. And my political realist side might say there'll be a third way and we'll figure it out. But it will be a product of struggle. It won't be something lawyers invent. It'll be something that comes out of conflicting social forces. But I also have the sort of utopian side that we could imagine a world where information is freed from the property constraint altogether. And that might be a great boon to transformation and development throughout the rest of the economic, social and cultural realm. Wouldn't that be a fabulous thing? But like everybody else, I have to make a living off information. So it's like, all right, well, that's the vision, but where is the middle path? But where it will emerge, it seems to me, is out of a set of conflicts, and not just played out in what I call the overdeveloped world. I've got some sense that we like overshot the mark in the West. You know, people used to talk about the developed world and the underdeveloped world, which strikes me as a little judgmental. So the terms I use are underdeveloped world and overdeveloped world. You know, maybe we kind of overshot a little bit, and we're just sort of not quite sure how we could kind of keep expanding an economy further and further. I don't know about you, but I've got one of everything. You know, has everybody got one of everything? I kind of have. I got, you know, one computer and one TV and one stereo, and do I need 6 of them? Is that what's next, or do I need a bigger one of each of these? And I just don't really get it. You know, there's for the middle class, consumption reaches some kind of threshold, it seems to me. So maybe we overshot. You know, my brother-in-law's just bought one of those McMansions. You know, it's this like amazing, huge structure, and I figured out part of the deal is that's the only way you can keep consuming more stuff. Because the old house was just full of stuff, so you need a bigger one so that you can keep the cycle kind of going. And it just strikes me at some point we overshot the mark. So in the overdeveloped world, we kind of have this problematic relation to new forms of production and growth and development. It's all just kind of more and bigger. But in the underdeveloped world, the issue of getting beyond necessity and scarcity is still very much alive and well. And let's not get too carried away with the kind of post-industrial, post-modern, it's all over worldview, because for 2/3 of the world it's not. But the development paths might hinge to some extent on what information is available, and that's how these worlds are related. You know, it's a dirty little secret, but the enormous kind of growth of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries is pretty much based on stealing other people's information. You know, copyright's really not observed in this country until it becomes a net producer. And then the law starts to shift progressively towards what will become a strict IP regime. But its initial kind of growth was based very much on sort of ripping stuff off. As you may know, Oscar Wilde came here, Dickens came here, Trollope came here. The reason was, if you didn't show up, you had no way to protect your copyrights whatsoever. So it was just like this incentive. And even if you showed up, the stuff's going to be still printed in thousands of editions by all sorts of different people. We all know the name of Tom Paine because of Piracy. All of those thousands of editions of this book that made him famous, he had absolutely no control over. And it founds a kind of political discourse in the Republic. So it's got a political as well as economic dimension. But you have to ask if that opportunity is going to be available to the developing world now. I forget the number. It's in the current issue of Wired magazine talking about Brazil. If each license of Microsoft Office costs how many bags of soybeans, and it's something like 50. You know, I forget the actual number, but it's a tangible number. And you sort of start to think, well, how is development possible between that gap? So, in short, I'm trying to think the whole lot. Yeah.
Are they going to put Microsoft on a 3D PC? I don't think the PC is going to be close to 3D.
No, and there's a distinction between the tangible world of things and the world of information that's the partial, I keep saying partial escape from the law of scarcity. but yeah, there's no such thing as open source hardware beyond some very, very minor experiments that's actually kind of going to work. So that's the, I'm not suggesting that there's some way to transform the economy of things, although it seems to me that a transformation of the economy of information will transform that economy of things in as yet unknown ways. But can't beat the mixed economy, it seems to me, for that economy of things. I think most of the world has kind of figured out that the market does this part of it, and here are the exceptions, and here are the other modes of provision for that. So, in short, trying to think world history from the present, what does the role of the production of information play at the moment, and how has it changed by its corralling within the concept of property? What conflicts does that produce that we're involved in? What social movements occur around the category of information, and how might the conflict play out? Strikes me as the set of possibilities within which we're caught at this moment. I don't have an enormous portfolio of brands or patents to defend, so how you do it's not my problem. But thinking about how that is in a relation to a social movement that wants to re-socialize it is, as a social scientist and scholar, that strikes me as the interesting struggle of our time. So I'll leave off the rant at that particular point if people have thoughts, questions, ideas. Jeremiads.
One of the places where I see this being played out, a lot of, like you said, a lot of it, there are two forces and they're not really hitting a central ground yet, but one of the places where I see it's happening, are you familiar with the open access movement in scholarly research? It seems like where really government is having to look at that in a serious way, and kind of wondering your thoughts on that, and you see that how it's playing out and how it's playing out in terms of what you're talking about as well.
Yeah, I was on the library committee at a university in Australia for a while, and we had this great graph, which was at the current rate of acceleration, at what point does the budget for scientific journals exceed the entire operating budget of the university? And it was going to happen within 10 years. Didn't come to pass, but that was part of the reason why. But clearly, a kind of quasi-monopoly position in the marketplace was really going to kill us. We had to think about that seriously. But how one might democratize access to knowledge more generally strikes me as the kind of larger problem. I'm very interested in MIT's approach to that in sharing courseware. It doesn't get you the degree, you might notice. You could pass all the courses in your own mind, but you still don't get the one thing that remains scarce, which is access to the piece of paper. But if we continue to kind of polarize access to education, it strikes me we're creating a problem for ourselves in the long run, of which within that, the kind of corralling of particularly useful bits of technical and scientific information within a kind of proprietary model, that's not adding a real lot in terms of value, it seems to me. I had friends at Elsevier who would talk about the wonderful new tools they were adding, and it's sort of like, yeah, it's sort of like a search engine you got there, I can get one of those just with a few mouse clicks. What are you really doing for me there? Yeah, but still a problem, it seems to me. Much as I admire Robert Maxwell, who figured out how to do this by buying rights to Russian technical journals and translating them was the basis of his whole business. And it's a wonderful kind of historical irony that he kind of privatized socialist knowledge and flogged it to the rest of the world and built an empire. But, back to the great irony I'm still trying to puzzle out about our time is how the fate of the continued growth and health of the commodity economy is now in the hands of Chinese communists. If someone had told you that 15 years ago, you would have thought they were nuts, but that's the world we're now in. Isn't that a wonderful paradox? Yeah.
Any thoughts about the inevitability of the information getting out of this box that it's in? If I substitute Richard Dawson's concept of the meme with your word information, then it has a life of its own, and it's gonna come out whether we like it or not. Did you do any research in that area or talk about that in the book?
Meme I find a slightly problematic concept because what Dawkins doesn't really want to address is its identity as it's replicated. It's a theory that makes sense if you think about it as the same thing, but it sort of starts to break down when you start to think about what information theory or communication theory tells you about difference, the role difference plays in how information is constituted. So I don't actually directly refer to Dawkins, but it was a wonderfully suggestive metaphor and part of a sort of epochal transformation in knowledge. And if you think about the way that our operating models across whole bodies of knowledge have moved from a kind of clockwork model to an energy or engine model to an information model, it was one of the key moments in that making that transformation. From moving away from thinking about biology on an energy model to an information model. It was like the third epistemic kind of shift. And in that sense, kind of very interesting. And I don't want to speculate on the role of information in biology, because I don't think it's well enough understood. The extent to which Dawkins hinges the kind of analogy of meme on gene strikes me as also then problematic. So I'm not entirely sure that genes are information in the same sense. So it's a little bit too much to still nut out to be able to use these terms all that well. But there is something really interesting in the fact that memes are propagated in this very, very different model to genes. That they can, in fact, move sideways, if you like. Whereas in genetics, it seems to be a much more exceptional moment when genes move sideways. There's a kind of reproductive model that the mimetic doesn't have that makes it quite interesting. But I think your other question is one that I do take a position on, which is that I think it's an ontological given that information has a kind of only formal relation to the material substrate in which it's expressed. And that what we've realized through a set of technical stages of evolution is that underlying fact, that we discovered a fact through producing it, if you like. And it's one that we've yet to kind of come to terms with at any level. And Dawkins' speculations are part of that process, it seems to me. But that we're creating realities that start to escape from our economic model, our philosophical models that we've yet to come to terms with. But for me, it's, I am making a strong argument that ontology is on the side of the statement that information wants to be free. It's more than a kind of utopian, we used to call it the California ideology in the world I came from. It was more than that. It was a really quite profound statement about an ontology.
Do you address the issue anywhere of the difference between quality information and just bad information? Because with land, there's, an inherent scarcity of property. We only know there's so much, and with currency or capital, there's only so much that's created. But with information, we sort of a different sense of churning, and where the value almost becomes more the access or the meta information to trying to get to what you need. Do you address that at all in this?
David Ricardo, who's sort of the original thinker of the difference between what's called ground rent and profit, has a whole kind of model of why rent is a bad thing because of the inherent scarcity of land. And Ricardo is on the side of capital versus the landlords. As if to say, if we get to that model, it's a more abstract model. And you prevent that kind of exorbitant extraction of rent, which he wants to kind of get away from. And the sort of immediate political circumstances was that you couldn't import corn into the British Isles. And so the landlords were extracting a kind of super rent from land indirectly because of the super price that you could get for the corn. And so Ricardo was on the side of history and of abstraction. But we now use the expression rentier class for anybody who creates an artificial set of scarcities. And I think we might have produced those in the information world. We're producing kind of rentier extraction over and above what the market would normally allow if competition actually operated. Yeah.
Given how agriculture worked in Europe and America, was Ricardo on the side of history, because most countries subsidize their farmers up their ears, one way or another.
Yeah, do now. But I'm talking about what's his book called? The Theory of Political Economy, and I can't remember the title, but it's what, about 1818, 1820, something like that. And at that moment, it's an argument against protectionism that I think is still valid. And Ricardo.
What happened in the market?
Sorry.
Look at what happened in Congress.
Well, as somebody from an agricultural exporting country, I'm completely against this agricultural protectionism in Japan, United States. My country was a founder of the Cairns Group, so I'm very, very much on the side of free trade and agricultural goods. Globalisation, I think, is generally a good thing, but interesting set of historical processes by which one, in a sense, reverses back to this kind of protecting of a set of politically sensitive constituencies in order to form majorities, and so on. So when I say on the side of history, it's a history we've yet to realise where goods can be freely traded. So I'm a left-wing free trader, which people may think is a non-existent category, but I think Marx was. Of course, one would do well to attend to the costs of that kind of globalisation, but it's how you increase productivity, efficiency, and so on.
It might be a little far out, but it seems to me that a lot of what we value about physical goods, which you say are sort of exempted from these problems right now, is not about the matter that they're made of, but sort of the intellectual property and the thought that goes into making them. So, like the PC, which was cited earlier, as something that they're still going to have to buy in Brazil. They can't just pirate. I mean, if you look at PCs in China and elsewhere, they are pirated. The design is pirated. The VCR was pirated. So there's this sort of precedent for physical objects suffering from the intellectual property transferring. And I think that as manufacturing processes get even more automated and even easier, and we get rapid prototyping machines are used for manufacturing more now. It seems like the information becomes more important in the role of physical goods as well. Yes. And I'm wondering if you think is that a bigger problem, or does that somehow in the future turn out to be a bigger problem than just the problem of movies and CDs and software? Or are we dealing with the big problem now, and we're going to sort of maybe come up with some solution and solve this now that will then spare us from the trouble that comes when I can just put my PC in a copier and hit go?
One could speculate on what would have happened if intellectual property had been rigorously enforced in China over, let's say, the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of stuff wouldn't have been able to have been made, and a lot of the growth that we're now dependent on would never have happened. And it would strike me to have been a very, very negative consequence for that to have taken place. So through that theft of design, in this case, let's say design of hardware, design of whole production processes too, copied as they were in the States, let's say a century ago, has had a kind of net benefit that it's enabled this enormous kind of productive engine to crank up into gear. I learned the other day there are now 80 million industrial workers in China. And that's a country, that's a large country working enormous kind of productive energy, in part based on ideas somebody else owned or claimed to have owned, but for which a kind of rent was sought unnecessarily, unjustly, as a kind of limit to productivity. So yes, I think those issues are probably in the long run a bit more crucial. Who owns the design of the productive process itself? Probably more crucial than who owns the latest CD to come out, or the latest video game, or whatever, even if that's the end of it that you're usually seeing discussed.
Yeah, so you see the information of correction analysis at the latest stage of the process of abstraction and formalization of property. A lot of times that's seen as a movement toward greater control, greater intelligibility, predictability, calculability of the future, whereas actually you see it as breaking away from that direction, it seems. So at what point that break occur? How does that information become, turn from being something that's greater controlled to now being uncontrolled? Right?
Yeah, it's a wonderfully contradictory movement. On the one hand, that we're creating this sort of rationalized space and time.
Right.
And my emblem of that is sort of logistics, that you can send a FedEx package anywhere in the world. It's passing through a kind of rationalized space and time. That wonderful image in the movie Castaway where, what's his name, the actor who stars in it, Tom Hanks, sends a clock to himself. And his job is to try to sort out logistics to make Russia, join this new kind of logistical space that's rationalized space and time. But as the movie kind of emblematizes, that yet produces these swirls of kind of turbulence and chaos out of that very abstraction and rationalization. So it's a sort of dual movement that we create more rationalized space and time, but which is creating these new kind of swirls and eddies of complexity out of it, for which we don't really yet kind of quite have the tools to deal. So I think that's a wonderfully, kind of exciting and interesting transformation that's taking place, but with that double aspect. One could analogously talk about warfare in the same terms, that we have the tools to kind of rationalize the battlefield, and yet we keep kind of the fog of war, or what Clausewitz calls friction, just keeps coming up in new forms.
All right. Well, thank you very much.